I'm Mindy Peterson, and this is Enhance Life with Music, where we explore the ways music can make our lives better and spotlight the resources you can use to enhance your life with music. If you've listened to this podcast for long, you probably know that I love books and love reading. I love chatting with authors about their books, especially new releases and also timeless classics. Today's guest is the author of a new release. And there were two things about his new book that immediately caught my attention. I'll describe those in a moment. But first, my guest today is joining me from Cleveland, Ohio. Thomas Morris had a 50-year career in the music business that included leadership of the Boston Symphony and Cleveland Orchestra. He is in demand internationally as a consultant, teacher, and writer, most recently of the book we're talking about today that released in the fall. It's called Always the Music: How a Lifelong Passion Framed a Future for Orchestras. Welcome to Enhance Life with Music, Tom.
Mindy, my great pleasure to join you.
Well, Tom, I loved your book. It was sort of like this state of the industry reflection after your 50-year career in the music world. And there's so much content. But like I said, there were a couple things that really caught my attention about your book. The first thing, and I'm sure we'll refer to this throughout our conversation, but you point out in the book that our orchestra model was established in the early 1900s. And it hasn't really changed a whole lot since then, in spite of the fact that there's been major changes during that time to things like music education in schools, the competitive landscape of entertainment options that consumers have, consumer access to music on demand, not to mention a global pandemic that's happened, more recently. So that was one thing that really caught my attention. Like, wow, that has been 100 plus years of this remarkably unchanged model of the orchestra. A second thing that really caught my attention, intrigued me, is one of the endorsements of your book was by Jim Collins, who is famous for his best-selling business books, including Good to Great and Built to Last. I'm a huge fan of interdisciplinary learning and collaboration. And the music world and the academic world can both be pretty siloed. So when I saw that there was a Jim Collins endorsement on a nonprofit orchestra book, that really caught my attention. Jim, in his endorsement, says, if there is one book to read about music, one book that captures the human alchemy that makes a great orchestra or festival tick, this is it. So it's quite a testimonial there. And in reading the book, I saw that he urged you to write this book. You include an entire chapter on meeting Jim, your friendship with him, and how his insights informed your work in the music world. So explain to listeners how this connection with Jim came to be.
Sure. I'm a curious fellow, and I had spent the first sort of 2/3 of my career running the Boston Symphony and the Cleveland Orchestra. And towards the end of my Cleveland period, starting I think around 1996 or 97, I became increasingly sort of interested in thinking about sort of the management, leadership, and organizational challenges of these organizations in a broader context. I've always been somewhat of a student of business literature, but I emphasize somewhat because what I don't like is jargon-laden treatises on how to manage and how to lead. And I came across an article in the Harvard Business Review, I think it was 1997, about vision, institutional vision, organizational vision, by Jim Collins and another fellow, Jerry Porras. The two of them had written a book recently called Built to Last, a best-selling book that basically was all about how you build enduring organizations. And I found this article in the Harvard Business Review spoke to me very, very deeply. That I'm really interested, particularly in the cultural world and these great musical institutions, in the whole question of vision. But vision is a gooey concept? What is it?
Yeah.
And how do you really make it work as a working concept and a construct for running an organization? And this article framed a way of doing that which spoke to me. And it basically is the premise that if you want to know and outline where you want to go, that's what people think of as vision, where are you going to go in the future?
Uh-huh.
That you can't really do that without understanding where you are first. So it's this sort of this notion of what are the fundamental definitions of who you are and what do you stand for, which are unchanging. And against that, where do you want to go? And by the way, how will you know when you get there?
Yeah.
And and uh, and that's the model in very simple terms. And that just struck me as remarkably insightful and helpful,
Mm.
and I think usable. And so I decided, gee, let's see if we can apply that to the work we were doing at the Cleveland Orchestra.
Uh-huh.
And the Cleveland Orchestra is a successful organization, and but still, you have to have some notion of where you're trying to take it. And so we embarked on a year and a half sort of project on the staff to see if we could apply the model and come up with a vision statement. And one of Colin's premises also is if it's going to be real, it has to go to the very essence of what your purpose is. It's not a list of things to do.
Mm.
It's what do you stand for, and really why do you exist?
Yeah.
And the whole vision statement you have to put on one piece of paper.
Yeah.
So it's by definition there's just no room for jargon.
Yeah. Well, and that was one thing I think that attracted you to that article,
Yeah, that's
is
right.
that it wasn't full of just the usual jargon that you encountered in
Correct.
business
Correct.
articles.
And it was a useful and we developed this. And in the course of my work in applying this, I reached out to Jim to say that I had really enjoyed this and I was trying to apply it. And he responded, and we started corresponding. Turns out he's a music lover, and she was sort of intrigued with how to apply this to not-for-profit world.
Yeah.
And it ultimately led to I was involved in inviting him to give a keynote speech to the League of American Orchestras annual conference. And I think it was 2000, he actually came to Cleveland for a weekend to hear concerts and participated in one of our final sort of staff sessions and trying to refine this vision statement. And it was just all a remarkable meeting. He always says that he is not very good at providing answers, but he's world class at asking questions.
I think
And
you said in your book that it's almost exhausting to be around him
it
because
is,
he's
yeah,
constantly asking why.
that's right. Yeah, when you say something, I mean, he's always pushing, and I deeply admire it. And anyways, out of all this, we became very good friends,
Mm.
and we're in frequent touch. I see him every 6 months or so, go out and visit him, and he comes here. And so we've become very good friends, and we're constantly, talking about what we're up to.
Yeah.
I've been a critical reader for some of his writings.
Mm.
He was early in urging me to write something before I really thought I could try and do it. And what was really, I think, the best part of all of it is after he wrote Good to Great, he was so intrigued with how the concepts in that book applied or not to the not-for-profit world that he produced a monograph called Good to Great for the Social Sectors.
Yes, I
You know,
found that fascinating.
yeah,
Yeah, so, I mean, it was really it sounds like his work with you and in those nonprofits that really led to the
yeah,
creation of that supplemental
yeah,
publication.
yeah. And so it's been. Uh, he's a hugely important person in my life, because at this sort of juncture, I was approaching this juncture in my work with the Cleveland Orchestra that I knew I was going to be leaving. I think it's terribly important when you have a leadership job in the not-for-profit world that you don't overstay your welcome.
Sure.
You know when to leave. And I knew that something else was going to beckon. And so he really helped provide a much broader context for how I was thinking about things that paved the way for, I finally, when I retired from the Cleveland Orchestra, 20 years ago in 2004, he was at my side cheerleading.
Mm.
And, go for it, go for it.
Yeah.
It's think of what's important. Don't hang on to the past, go for the future. And as things then, fell into my lap, going to the Ojai Music Festival as the artistic director, it was Jim, who understood that and encouraged me. I did a lot of teaching. He helped with that. It's just been a great friend and mentor.
Yeah. Well, a couple things that you mentioned very casually that I just want to highlight because I don't think it's something to gloss over is number one, you encountered Jim's work by reading an article in the Harvard Business Review, which I don't know how many leaders of nonprofit orchestras are reading
Mm-hmm.
Harvard Business Review,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that speaks volume. I mean, I am such a fan of interdisciplinary learning, and I
That's
feel
right.
that different industries can offer so much to one another. I mean, any
Absolutely.
musician who's listening to this is probably aware of how much, as musicians, we've been able to benefit from sports psychology in terms of performance strategies. And there's been so many ways that business leaders and other industries have been able to benefit from the creativity of musicians, whether it's engineers who are also musicians or, other ways. So that's the one thing I want to point out. Second thing I want to point out that you just casually mentioned is that you reached out to Jim and contacted him. And I think that so often we don't it doesn't even occur to us to do something like that. And people are thrilled to be able to help out, and to be able to help transfer their advice to other areas and thrilled that people are getting something out of it. That's why people write books. And so but
Well,
but not many people take that effort and take that initiative to reach out in that way.
but also, Jim was genuinely fascinated
Mm.
with this world. One of his premises that he uncovered in the Good to Great study is that, money with really, really great successful organizations. And again, Jim's study was the difference between great organizations and merely good ones.
Mm.
Not good and bad, but great versus good.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's a really critical distinction.
Yeah.
And it has, I think, just thinking about the difference between really great and merely good is a concept that in the arts where you're always striving for excellence, you really have to understand what are the hallmarks that make things really distinctive and great. Jim was fascinated with that, with the not-for-profit world, and he, in his work for the Good to Great study, pointed out that money is really more of a strategy than a goal.
Yes, that was fascinating
Yeah,
to read that.
yeah, and that in fact, it's the commitment to an overarching vision for the future that distinguishes great commercial companies. Well, that translates perfectly to the not-for-profit world,
Oh,
which
totally.
and I think when he did the monograph for the social sectors, he and I were in very close contact. And I remember at the very beginning, we were talking about what are the similarities between the for-profit and the not-for-profit world in terms of using this model. And we quickly came to the conclusion that it's not what's similar, it's what's dissimilar that you have to focus on.
Hmm.
And that's where he talked in the monograph that in the not-for-profit world, you can't measure everything by money, but what you do is you build evidence of success. What are the how do you know you're successful in the
Mm.
not-for-profit world? And I know lots of not-for-profits which are very successful from a financial standpoint, but not very successful from conceptual content.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, back to your point about vision, and part of
Vision.
vision is knowing how do we know if we've achieved it?
That's right. That's right. So Jim has been an enormous friend of mine. I mean, I to back up a minute. When I decided to write this book, the reason I really wrote it was the famous, I call it Chapter 11, not bankruptcy, but Chapter 11 in the book, which is the one which is really a think piece about the future of orchestras in the world of music.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to write. But I realized that I couldn't really write that in a compelling way because my own views over my career have changed and evolved. And
Mhm.
as I thought about that, I all of a sudden realized that there were these individuals in my life that really, frankly, taught me at critical moments. And one of those was Jim Collins.
Yeah. Well, that was one thing that struck me too about your book is that you do talk about your own personal journey and sort of this metamorphosis and how, this is what I thought at this point, but then I came to realize something else. And I like that you're obviously are a very curious person, as you mentioned, as Jim must be. But I like that you're not afraid to change your mind and learn from what you're discovering. Back to your point about money being a strategy and not a goal, I know you talked in the book about the impact of that belief on fundraising, which really caught my attention because I do work in my day job with a lot of music faculty who are often fundraising. Most often, in my case, my involvement is when they're fundraising for a new Steinway piano.
Mhm.
But you talk about how fundraising is predicated on what is to be supported and like really talking about why the money is needed and
Correct.
framing that need as the pitch and kind of that supporting this belief that money is a strategy and not a
Sure.
goal. So that was really interesting. The other thing you talk about that really caught my attention, you talked about in your work with the orchestra and really defining its vision, you came to the conclusion that your reason for being was not necessarily to put on great concerts. That's what orchestras do, but it's
Correct.
not why they do it.
Correct.
And it was really helpful for you to really realize that the goal was defined more by creating transcendent experiences.
Correct.
And again, the concert was a strategy and not a goal. So,
That's right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So,
That's I mean, I think I think it's really helpful to sort of think conceptually, and I like building models, and sure, you have this notion of a value, of a hierarchy of concepts of values, purpose, vision, strategies, tactics, um, and almost most organizations are mired in strategies and tactics,
mm.
um, and also they generally think sort of incrementally from the present. And the beauty of the Collins model is you sort of define this bedrock of principles of what do you stand for and why do you exist? And then you look out 10, 20 years and say, this is what we'd like to be. And then you structure strategies in relation not to the present, but in relationship to where you're going. So, in a funny way, it's a pulling concept toward the future, not a pushing from the present.
Hmm.
And I just find that really helpful.
Yeah. Staying balanced in life is very important to me. Balance in work and play, activity and rest, and balance in fueling my energy. When I am on the go or just find my cupboards running a little bare, the fuel I reach for is Jam Bar energy bars. These bars are certified organic whole food bars. They're non GMO and gluten free. I especially love that they are higher in protein than the other all natural bars I found, and they're minimally sweetened with only all natural sweeteners. Well, I love all five flavors. My personal favorites are musical mango and tropical trio. Jambar flavor names reflect the company founder's passion for music. And Jambar donates a whopping 50% of net profits to programs that support music and active living. Join me in supporting a balanced life and world by reaching for Jambars. Available at Amazon, select retailers, and jambar.com. Links are in the show notes. You talk in the book, too, about your work with Interlochen in Michigan, which I'm originally from Michigan, and my parents have lived for 20-some, 30 years maybe now, near Interlochen. So that's something that definitely caught my attention. But you talked about how Interlochen has often cited its purpose and as training young artists. And that's something that they've highlighted that for years with their PR.
Yeah.
But it was determined that the vast majority of their alum were not active performers. And so it was really helpful to realize that and kind of conclude that their reason for their purpose was not necessarily to train artists as defined by people who became famous for performing. It was more sparking enthusiasm for the arts. And
Correct.
a lot of its alum ended up becoming doctors or lawyers
Correct.
or, other vocations, but recognizing the value and having people in those vocations that were informed by the arts and enthusiastic art supporters. So that was really fun to read about.
Well, if you think about sort of the whole arts ecosystem, it's not just made up of performers. I mean, the audience and the supporters and the communities, are as important,
Oh, yeah.
frankly, to make it work.
Yes.
And what's intriguing about Interlochen is it's really educating all parts of that. So I guess it was when we did that exercise when I got on the board of Interlochen, and the story is that one of my early board meetings, the leader said, "Well, we know it's time for a big endowment drive," and I raised my hand and said, "Why?" And well, it's time for an endowment drive, but why? Well, we need the money. I said, "Well, you won't succeed. You cannot raise money because you need it. You have to raise your money because it is going to be there to make something happen that is important for the future that you define."
Mm.
And so then the question is, so what's the future? And it wasn't clear. So that's why we applied the Collins model at Interlochen in an exercise with the full board over a year and a half to really try and focus that question.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had the fund drive, and of course we exceeded the goal.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, you talk a lot about renewal, organizations going through it, vision, what the challenges are, and in renewal, not just with businesses or organizations, but personal
Correct.
renewal too. You talk about applying those elements to individuals, how we develop and grow and reinvent ourselves. And I love how you say in the book, I now see my own journey as one of constant renewal. At the core, I have always been a passionate music lover, but how I expressed it evolved.
Yeah.
And then you go on to talk about how Jim Collins gave you the tools and encouragement to address transformation, to simultaneously, quote, preserve my core value of passion for music and stimulate progress and finding ways to give it life. So love that.
Yeah. Well, it's true. And I hadn't really understood any of that about myself before I wrote the book. When I wrote the book, I had to sort of think about all that. And what I learned in writing the book is that I've had the world's luckiest career. I mean, I've done what I loved, but how it has evolved has actually been the most fascinating thing. And with all the hindsight of the world now, makes total sense to me. I initially thought I will go into the orchestra management business. And I ended up, very early on, in terms of a goal, if you want to be an orchestra manager, at the very height, running these two great institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly the Cleveland time was an intensely rich one for me because of the amazing creative partnerships that I had with Christoph Andognani, the music director, and particularly the board president at the time, this fellow Ward Smith. There's a chapter about him. And so it was really when I got to Cleveland that all of a sudden I understood, having a common vision amongst the leaders, and then making it happen, each doing their own part. And I think the Cleveland years were a great example of how that can be very powerful. It's almost 1 + 1 + 1 = 10. It's an amazingly powerful leverage situation.
Mm-hmm.
But I also came to understand that having positions of power and scale, bigger and bigger and all that, really, they don't mean much. And to me, what I discovered that's actually that's not who I am. What I really am is I'm a musician, and I like making concerts, creating concerts with great artists, and I'm really good at that. And I left the executive role, and I went from these huge multi-million-dollar organizations to the teeny little Ojai Festival, which actually punches way above its weight in terms of impact artistically, because it's so concentrated. And I focused on purely the artistic side for the last third of my career. And it fundamentally changed how I think about music, because all of a sudden, I realized that for 35 years, I was in the orchestra world of music. And when you're running an orchestra, you're doing orchestral music, and it's great music. But it's only a small part of what music is.
Mm.
And I got to Ojai, and all of a sudden I was into world music, I was into chamber music, I was into jazz, I was into contemporary music, huge amount of contemporary music, working with all different kinds of artists. And I just lapped it up.
Well, you alluded to that chapter 11, orchestra redo. And that was, obviously I love the Jim Collins chapter. This was also one of my favorite chapters. It really draws on everything that you learned over your 50-year career. You reflect on the current state of orchestras and musical creativity. What recommendations do you have for listeners who are involved in music organizations, whether it's an orchestra, a music festival, a music department at an institution? What recommendations do you have for those listeners who want to follow your lead in clarifying vision for their nonprofit, stimulating renewal? What words of wisdom do you have in addition to reading your book?
The most important message that I wanted to impart, is that the challenges for these organizations, are just so enormous today. And going back to what you said at the very beginning, the model for how these organizations are structured today basically is pretty unchanged, but the environment is completely changed.
Sure.
And so everyone's struggling. There are enormous financial problems in most organizations. There are enormous audience problems. There are enormous relevance problems, all those things. And I think the fundamental principle to start from when you think about how to deal with this is actually with the music. What is the purpose? Why do these organizations exist? And again, I go right back to what you said when you're quoting the book, that the purpose of these organizations is not to give good concerts. It's not to provide employment. It's not to lead social change. It's not to, all those things. Those are all maybe subtexts here and there, but it's really to create transcendent experiences for audiences. Mm. And I have implicit faith in audiences. I think most organizations dumb down the audience by saying we have to only play what we think they want to hear. And that's the exact opposite of what you have to do. You have to lead taste. You don't follow taste. And audiences are not found. They're created. And I know this from personal experience. Anyone who looks at what we did with the Ojai Music Festival, who'd never been there, says, well, that's all very interesting, but does anybody show up? Because the programs are wild. And the answer is yes, everything's full. I was just last week in Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
Ah, not far from me.
No, I but I went out. There's a little orchestra there, the South Dakota Symphony, that has a very interesting and wonderful conductor, a fellow named David Geyer. And he's been there 20 years. And this orchestra has been cited in the press for several years as something really interesting is going on there. And this little orchestra in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, performed a completely forgotten opera by an American composer who is also forgotten, Douglas Moore, called Giants in the Earth, which was written, I think, in 1951 and received a Pulitzer Prize and has had one performance since. It's totally forgotten.
Wow.
And the story of the opera is based on a book by a Norwegian writer who lived in Sioux Falls, and it's about the Norwegian settlers coming to South Dakota.
Oh, interesting.
And they usually do one performance of a concert out there. They did two of this Giants in the Earth in a hall that seats 1,600 people, and it was full both nights.
Wow.
And it's because they have established a relationship with that community of trust. And any normal logical thinking would say, are you crazy to do something like that? But no, they delivered it with conviction. They made it an event. It was topical because of the subject matter. And it was just amazing.
Wow.
And that's how you have to think.
You quote an orchestra executive in your book who said, "The status quo is an existential threat, brilliantly disguised as stability," which I thought that's a good quote for all of us to keep in mind, whether we're thinking about our own personal lives, our business, a nonprofit organization.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So that's really why I wrote the book. I wanted to convey that message. And the only way I knew how to tell that story and make that point was not to simply write a series of platitudes. I needed to describe how that feeling evolved in my own thinking from the people I worked with and the work I did. So it's considered out of experience, and it works, and it is absolutely necessary. And last week, a classic example, I saw it in person.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I'm going to just mention another quote that was in your book. You quote Franz Johansson, who says, "When you step into an intersection of fields, disciplines, and cultures, you can combine existing concepts into a large number of extraordinary new ideas." So that really speaks to just that value of interdisciplinary learning and collaboration. And certainly this book is a great example of that.
At the end of the book, in maybe it's in a moment of supreme ego or something, I don't know, but I tried to summarize what are three words that describe me or what I stand for. And the three, which I think are absolutely real and others do as well, is curiosity, imagination, and exuberance.
Those are three good ones.
Well, and I think looking, what do you do now with this situation? I wish all musicians had courses in curiosity, imagination, and exuberance in what they do. It's not just how you play the clarinet, but it's the way you convey the music and the fact that you are curious about listening to classical music, jazz, world music, and be free to sort of borrow concepts between them. It's that interdisciplinary point that you're making, but it starts with just having curiosity.
Three cheers for curiosity, for sure.
and I absolutely think that you can teach curiosity. You can teach it by simply, forcing people into uncomfortable positions in other situations, and so they have to deal with it.
Mm,
And you sort of things you like and things you don't like, but all of a sudden, what you really want is people to open their minds.
mm. Great word to end on. Well, we're out of time here, but I do have to share just one more quote. As you can tell, I love quotes.
Yeah.
And I always like seeing which quote an author selects to put at the very beginning of their book on those entry pages. And when I read yours, I just started laughing because I have interviewed a lot of authors. I've heard a lot of authors interviewed on other podcasts, and they talk so often about what an arduous process it is to write a book, get it published. And when I read that beginning quote to your book on the intro pages there, it
Oh,
was
the Winston Churchill.
yes, Winston Churchill. He said, writing a book is an adventure. To begin with, it is a toy and an amusement. And then it becomes a mistress. And then it becomes a master. And then it becomes a tyrant. And the last phase is that just as you are about to be reconciled to your servitude, you kill the monster and fling him about to the public. I thought, oh, this sounds like a great way to encapsulate the process based on what I've heard from a lot of authors.
Well, I figured that why should I talk about my journey in writing the book? Churchill captured it perfectly, and, and I can tell you from personal experience, it is exactly that.
Oh, well, thank you for putting this book out into the world. I highly recommend it. As you know, I ask all my guests, Tom, to close out our conversation with a musical ending, a coda, by sharing a song or story about a moment that music enhanced your life. I'm sure you have a bazillion that you could select from, but do you have a song or story that you can share with us today in closing?
Sure, and in fact, it's the one that I opened the book with. I'm always asked, so what's the most amazing concert you've ever been to?
Nah.
Yeah. And I can answer that question precisely. And it was a concert that I produced in Ojai in 2017. The music director was Vijay Iyer, the jazz pianist composer. And that whole festival was structured around sort of as an homage to something called the AACM, Academy for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, founded by a group of black musicians in Chicago in 1965. And Vijay Iyer is kind of three generations in the line from that group. It's a fascinating movement that's not really known about much. And
Yeah, I've never heard of it, and I need to look it up.
You should look it up. And there's a marvelous book on the history of it by George Lewis, the composer. Anyway, we did a concert. It was a Sunday morning concert in Ojai, a 1-hour concert of free jazz improvisation with three musicians. A fellow named Muhal Richard Abrams, who was 89, pianist, who was one of the founders of the AACM.
Oh.
He died, unfortunately, about 3 months after, but he was there and played. Also, a fellow named Roscoe Mitchell, who played reeds, and Roscoe was in his early 80s. He was not a founding member, but he was an early member of the AACM. And then George Lewis, the composer, who was in his late 60s, he played trombone and turntables. And these three characters went out on stage, and they just played for 1 hour. It was the most bizarre, weird, strange, otherworldly music that was really hard to pigeonhole. As far away from everything I had done in my life up to that point.
Wow.
But it absolutely transfixed this audience, and it completely transfixed me. I mean, it was just jaw-dropping. I couldn't breathe. It was so intense and somehow honest. And I wondered, why did I respond this way? And I think there's a couple reasons for it. One is that I was ready. I was curious enough to be open to it. It was the setting. It was, beautiful Sunday morning outdoors at the Libby Bowl in Ojai. These three master musicians. But the most interesting thing to me is it proved that the new is not the province of the young.
Hmm.
Here are these really old guys, not reliving their greatest hits, but actually creating the future in real time.
Mm.
And that was completely overwhelming to me. And that is the concert that stands out above all others without any question.
Thank you so much to Tom for sharing that story, for joining us today, and for putting this book and its insights out into the world. As always, there are lots of links in the show notes to all the resources we discussed today, as well as a transcript of our conversation and related episodes you may enjoy, including Run It Like a Business, Proven Strategies to Grow Your Audience and Sustainably Fund Your Art, an interview with Renee Fleming on her recent book, and an episode on how businesses including Pfizer, Sony, and Unilever are using music to develop their executives' business and leadership skills. All Enhanced Life with Music episodes are evergreen, so check out the back catalog for more ways that music can make your life better. Thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing this show. Until next time, may your life be enhanced with music.